So you want to win your 500 years in the future pre-release. Well, I've won half of my pre-releases, never going worse than X1 in a pre-release event. And today, I'm here with my guide on how you can get good at sealed, what to look out for in the OP07 sealed format, and if you're brand new to the game, what even is sealed. This is my 500 years in the future pre-release guide. If you want to win this, you'll play this. Now, what you'll learn in this guide is the following: how a pre-release is played, the most optimal choices you can make beforehand, cards to look out for when building your deck or they can be played against you, and understanding the card pool and gameplay environment of this set. Now, disclaimer, everything I'm here telling you should never be superseded by one fact: are you having fun? Pre-releases are the first time to play with new cards, to play casually at your local game store, and to have fun with your friends. So if at any point I give you a piece of information and you go to yourself, this doesn't sound like a fun way for me to play the game, disregard it. Just try to use everything else you can that does sound fun or you don't have an opinion on to make the best version of your play experience possible. So how is a pre-release played? Well, each player will start by receiving 6 booster packs of the set, in this case OP07, and 1 2-card stamped promo pack. Now, for some stores, there's also an additional promo card that they give to everyone instead of just the top cut players. However, you cannot play that card. You can only play the cards in the stamp pack and the regular booster packs unless your store says otherwise, since again, it's supposed to be prizing and not part of your initial card pool. So then you'll open your 6 packs and your stamped pre-release pack and use what you have to construct a 40 card deck. So caveats here that are important to note is that your deck may contain cards of any color regardless of the color of the leader you end up playing. And you can ignore card restrictions like ban list or max 4-ofs that would be in a constructed event. The one thing that does matter is color and card type when it comes to card effects and abilities. So for example, OP02's Buggy, which only searches for red event cards, can only search for red event cards in a sealed event. And cards that require a subtype, either to target or to search or for cost and activations within your leader or the card, still require that card type. So for example, in this set, Sengoku can still only search 7 Warlords cards, and cards that need Kuja Pirates still need Kuja Pirates. And then very important is that you must bring your own leader to play with, or play with a leader from the cards you pull from your packs. You may bring a leader from any previous set or a pre-constructed deck or promo leader, but typically when it comes to leaders in the set being pre-released, you can only play with them if you pull them out of your packs to make it fair for people who can't go to multiple pre-releases since the cards aren't widely available yet. You also need to bring 10 Dawn cards for your Dawn deck. Please make sure to remember this. It's the #1 mistake I see people make when it comes to pre-release, and typically stores don't just have a bunch of extra ones lying around since packs don't contain Dawn in every pack now. And then once you build your deck, the really neat thing is that you can change out cards between rounds in your main deck. Anything you don't initially play with goes into your sideboard, and you can freely reconstruct your deck between games based on learning how cards work and maybe realizing, oh, this card will be good, or this card isn't as good as I thought it was. The one thing you can't change is your leader unless you change it with a leader that was in the set that you pulled. So for example, you can't start with a red Zora leader and then switch to a green Captain Kid leader, because at that point you're just doing it because you saw what everyone else is playing and what's in everyone else's pools and you're trying to get a leg up. You can, however, start with a red Zora leader and change to a blue Boa leader if you pulled that blue Boa. Next up, here's a list of all the viable leaders. These are leaders that are good in pre-release. Now, one thing to note here is that Yamato is on the viable list, and some people would argue that they are S tier. I would also argue that they are S tier, but for 07 specifically, there is a lot of blockers that I think makes it a little bit harder, so I moved them down to the viable tier for this one in particular. So on S tier, we have Red Zora, which makes all your characters hit just a little bit harder, which is great in a format with less card advantage, as well as like units that usually you're going to play that aren't the best stat traded because you need to make fill spots in your deck. Zora will upgrade your good units to better and your mad units to good, while also being a 5-life leader. Eustass Captain Kid, of course, gets multiple attacks, which is great for swinging down on big threats on board or trying to close out the game. Even if your opponent was able to wipe out your board, you're always going to be able to have 2 high power attacks with this leader. This leader is also great since because you're going to be priced into discarding cards through the powerful leader effect, you can play a lot of other non-counters that you normally wouldn't play in your deck because you can say, hey, I'm going to trash this anyway. And finally on S tier is Katakuri. He swings for 7 with 1 Dawn, which is just great value to start in hard for opponents to defend in limited. but he also gives you knowledge of what your opponent's going to be drawing or triggering, and same for you on terms of setting up your own triggers or finding your threats that are in your life you need to take damage to get them to hand ASAP. In the viable section, it really depends on what you pull and what you think you're going to see play with. Sanji is great because it takes advantage of vanillas while swinging hard or letting you multiplay cards. And vanillas are a huge part of the format. Same reason why the red film Uta leader is good. Law's down here because like every now and again there's sets with a bunch of good 1-2 drops and a bunch of good accessible 5 drops. And when that's the format, this leader can actually do some crazy stuff in limited, just like in constructed. And now will and forever be a cockroach. He is technically, when you think about it in a lot of ways, a 6 life leader on average, and thus he is viable. Piranha just gives you free board interaction, and thus she is viable. Blue Monkey D. Luffy is a 5 life leader that draws cards, which is one of the few things you can't do in limited so easily, gain card advantage, so he is viable. Blue Croc is a 5 life leader with interaction, so he is viable. And like we said, Yamato, a leader with double attack, and when your opponent's at 3 or less life, lets you throw around Arrested Dawn for power. Just instantly powerful, but again, not quite S tier, I think, in this specific set format because of the number of blockers in the set. Now, a caveat is that we do have a new challenger who could be making these lists in the Jewelry Bonnie leader from OP07. She's a 5 life green leader with 5,000 power, and once per turn on your opponent's attacks, you may pay 1 Dawn to rest one of your opponent's leader or character cards. So the way she's able to manipulate combat or open up your opponent's board to attacks when board control is a very important part of limited means that we keep your eye out for players playing this card in pre-release and even going forward into other pre-releases. Plus, in this set in particular, there are cards that get bonuses for having supernova leaders, so if they're not going to play Eustass Captain Kid, this is the next best one on average. Next, I'm going to go over some tips to think about when it comes to playing sealed that you might not be considering coming from only playing constructed or never playing at all. The first one is your opponent will typically have less 2k counters than normal. We'll go over some stats with cards in the entire set pool that will help illustrate this later. Same on with Yamato being susceptible to a lot of blockers as a leader in this set. But generally, because 2k counters are uncommon or above rarity, and there's less of them in general in a set, your opponent's going to have less in their hand. So swinging for 6k generally means you'll be able to pull 2 cards out of their hand or succeed on your swing on leader than in constructed, where they're going to have a bunch of 2k counters floating around to 1 card out of it. And even when they do 1 card 2k counter out of it, that does mean that later in the game they're going to have less 2k counters when they might need it more. And this rule scales up for swinging down on anything on board that's more than 5k. 6k is the general rule for swinging on leader, but obviously swinging 8 on 7 means you're going to get more value typically, and scale up, scale down from there. We mentioned it before, but card advantage is less accessible. Playing searchers is more of a risk as decks aren't fully stacked with the card type they need, so your opponent will have less resources to leverage at any time in the match compared to constructed. And so aside from the searchers just hitting less, your opponent actually has to open the searchers, open draw cards, and so in general, resources and individual cards matter more than ever. And this helps play into why swinging for 1k over in our first point is really powerful. Triggers are more likely. Because of the lack of color restrictions, any decent trigger should typically make a deck. So be aware of your non-yellow opponents having triggers. And we'll review how many relevant triggers I found in this set coming up. And compared to a few other sets like OP06, where there is a lot of triggers because there's a lot of powerful yellow cards in the set, I will say OP07 is at a little bit of a curve down from there, but you should still always remember and keep it in mind. And finally, power reduction is at a premium. You are more times than not fighting over board presence to win these games, so being able to reduce power on your opponent's units to make the attacks more likely to go through is super valuable in a limited environment. Power reduction cards are basically as good as KO and bottom deck cards are in constructed. And for this set with Revolutionary Army taking the stage, there is a lot more power reduction and good power reduction than there typically is. Now, when it comes to deck building, there's some things you should try to auto-include to make your deck the most powerful version of itself. The first thing is on-rate vanillas that cost 3 or greater. So basically, if a unit has no abilities on it, it should have 2k power more than its cost. So 3 cost should have 5k, 4 cost should have 6k, 6 cost should have 8k, etc. These cards are going to be your greatest baseline value, and you should play every single copy of it possible. You also might find cards that have effects on them but still have this trading. Maybe they sacrifice counter, or they're just really good because they have counter and an effect, and they're, let's say, a 7 cost with 9k power. Whenever it's 2k more than the cost, you should always include it. The asterisks for this are things under 3 costs. So 2 costs with 4k are a little harder to put in, but typically they'll make the cut because you'll need to make some filler space. And in Zoro, they are always on curve. And 1 cost for 3k are really hard to swing. I typically wouldn't recommend playing these at all outside of a Zoro deck, but you may find them a little bit more helpful depending on what the rest of your game plan is. As we talked about with 2k counters being scarce, 2k counters will always make the deck because they are super great in protecting your board and your leader. For that same reason, anything that blocks should also make the deck. Conditional blockers are, of course, the exception because they're not always going to block. But if it just says blocker, or you have a way to make sure that conditional blocker is on 90% of the time, you should play it. Events that give you at least 2k counter per the cost are also great. So for example, if an event costs 2 and it gives you 4k counter, you should play it. Once you get above 2 cost counter events, there's usually not the same trade-off of that level, but they have effects that matter. You need to look at the effects and realize whether or not they're going to be good with your game plan, and then play them from there. But typically across the board, the average event is more playable in sealed than it will be in constructed. Well-priced interactions, so things that KO, power reduce, bottom deck, return cards to hand, freeze cards, or rest them, you should always be looking at them and see if they're worth the cost on them or worth the stapled on targeting that's on a character or an event. These are the way you're going to be able to get advantage and gain tempo in your matches, where it's not like who wins die roll and who swings. And typically you're going to play almost every card that does one of these things, unless they do like the worst version of it, like only KOs at 2 costs and you have no cost reduction. And similar to events, triggers, as long as they're also good on board or they have good counter value stapled onto them, whether it's a counter event or just a character with counter, should almost always be played. It's a great way to come back from behind, and it's a great way to seal off things from ahead. You're trying to accrue as much value as possible in a game format that doesn't give you a lot of draw and a lot of card selection, so triggers are the greatest way to do that. And now, like I was saying, here's some stats on the OP07 card pool. This will kind of give you an idea of how many of each of these like card types that you're looking to play or looking to look out for from your opponents that you can pull based on their rarity. Because every pack's going to have 1 rare minimum up to 2 rares, a small number of uncommons, and a large number of commons. So for 2k counters, there are 5 in the set that are rare or above, and 8 that are under rare. For blockers, we're looking at 10 blockers rare and above, and 6 under rare. And I will note, a few of these are common, so you are going to find a lot of chump blockers running around. This set in particular has a lot of mid-sized blockers that can both play blocker or just be an offensive unit without having to commit a lot of resources for it. So be on the lookout for that. Free roll characters are characters that get played for free. Typically these are triggers, and in this set there's only 1 that's rare and above and only 1 that's under rare. So you don't have to look out for them that much, but I do have the 1 under rare to look out for that we'll look at later. Next up is interaction cards. Specifically, these are bouncing, KOing, bottom decking. We kind of broke out resting and reduction into its own thing because they do embody different game plan strategies and how you have to set up your board to prepare for your opponent playing them. In this set, there are 6 that are rare or above and 4 that are below rare. Resting cards, there's only rare and above ones. There are 4 cards that rest in the set and 0 that are below the cost of rare. So when it comes to resting, you're not going to see it as liberally, but there are some very powerful ones in this set. Next are triggers I thought were good in terms of the limited field. I found that there are 8 cards with trigger on them that are rare or above that the trigger effect is good, and 5 that are below rare. So definitely enough where you should be thinking about it and looking through the entire set list to figure out what are these triggers and what could be happening when I deal damage. And finally, power reducers that are rare or above, there are 4, and let me tell you, they are very good. Power reducers below rare, there's only 1, and honestly, it's not that great unless you're playing Zoro, but it will probably come up because it's stable to a body anyway, so be aware of that one. So, let's review some standout cards specifically for sealed from OP07. Now, members of the channel actually got a full live stream the day before this video went up, where we went over the entire OP07 pool, specifically from the lens of sealed, and I talked through every single card. These are some pull-out standouts that I think everyone needs to be aware of, but if you're enjoying the content on this channel and you want to get access to the entire OP07 sealed pool, consider becoming a member, supporting the content. We'd really appreciate it. First up is Ein. It's a rare card that is a 7 cost, 6k power with no counter. On play, sets up to one of your opponent's character's power to 0 for the turn, so it's a large body. It's pseudo removal because it not just reduces, it puts it to 0. So defending that thing is near impossible without blockers. and because it's a rare, it's pretty accessible to get pulled by anyone playing the event. Next is an SP actually, it's Okiku. Remember, the SPs are a subset of rarities pullable in the set. So even though this is the OP01 Okiku, it's still playable in the OP07 sealed environment if they pull it. This card is a 5,000 power for 3 costs, so it's vanilla stated, auto included, but it's such great early aggression because it has staple Dawn interaction of Dawn 1 when attacking, rest of the opponent's character costs 5 or less. This card is crazy for limited, and people don't generally know this aside from, you know, reading it, because there was no OP01 limited, so people didn't really interact with this card in the limited environment. But if this card comes down, it's going to be crazy, especially on turn 2, turn 3. Now, this is an SP, so there's likely only going to be one in your entire event that have this card, but it's good to remember that it does exist and could easily take over the game. Going back to reducers, this is Outlook the Third. He's a 0 power 2 cost character with 1k counter, which activate main, you may trash him from your board to give 2 of your opponent's characters minus 2k for the turn. It's better to think of this card as a 2 cost event that you play it and then you immediately sack it to give minus 2k to 2 things, because you're not really gonna play this card early and leave it on board that frequently. There's too many ways that could go wrong, and its cost to play is so low, you could probably just leave it. But in terms of board control, this card is crazy. For 2 Dawn, you're probably going to set up a turn where you're wiping the 2 things you target without any problems, unless your opponent is that far ahead on board control. And because it's rare, this card will definitely be seen across the pools, so you need to always think about what's the worst case scenario if my opponent outlooks 2 of my cards right now. This is Tanaka-san. This is the free roll character that's under rare, so it's accessible, but it is uncommon, so it's a little bit harder to get. It's a 3 cost 3k power with blocker, so you can pretty much play this in any deck as a chump blocker in limited. But it also has trigger played this card, so you just generally have to account for, what if my opponent got a free blocker here? Can I afford for that to happen? Is there a way I can win in 2 turns to play around this without losing pretty easily? So just want to make sure you are aware there is a free blocker from life in this set. Next is Baccarat, and this card is huge for limited. It's a 4,000 for 3 with blocker, so you auto include it as a chump blocker, but it has on opponent's attack once per turn. You may trash 1 card from your hand, give a leader or character plus 2,000 power during this battle, so you convert a 1k counter to a 2k, a no counter to a 2k counter, which is pretty crazy. And on top of all that, this card is a rare, so it's easily accessible. And as a 4k power for 3, it only takes 1 Dawn to make this blocker also an attacker. And they're not going to chump block with this card too often off the rip, because they want to get value out of that second ability when they can. And then there's Fisher Tiger at 6k for 5 with 1k counter that says this character can attack your opponent's character on the turn it's played. So basically it has rush for characters similar to Kairos from OP04, and it's a pretty sizable buy. It also has on play to rest something 6 or less if your leader has a Fishman or Merfolk type. This probably won't be relevant, but is good to know. But even just being a 6k rusher on characters for 5 is really good in limited, especially for taking back tempo. And since it has counter, there's no downside to playing this card in your deck at all, and it's a rare, so you're gonna see them flying around from table to table. This card is really interesting. This is a new 1-drop Zoro. It's a 2k power with 1k counter, but when it declares an attack, if you have 3 or more characters in play, and that includes this unit, this card will gain 2,000 power for the turn. So it's better to look at it as a 1-drop 4k that's easy to be attacked down back at, but if you're playing this in red Zoro, that means it's just a straight up attacker for 1 Dawn. Your opponent does have to deal with it if it's going to be online easily, and it's uncommon. So it's just really good to set up even late game in a turn where you need to really commit Dawn to the board to attack over a character, but you also need to set up a body to have a certain amount of attacks on the following turn. This Zoro piece will fit really well, and the barrier to entry in your deck is really low because it does have counter, and typically, like we talked about, you're going to need filler at some point. Next is a 2-drop event, Demonic Aura 9-sword style Ashura Demon 9 Flash. It's a main only effect that gives a leader or character plus 3k for the turn, and it has a secondary ability that says you may rest a cost 3 or greater character you control. If you do, rest up to one of your opponent's 5 or less cost characters. So you can use this to remove a blocker or put a threat that's currently active into rested, so you can attack it down, especially with that 3k boost. The 3k boost already gets you more value for 2 than the card's already good enough to play, but when you're then also converting that into the rest ability as well, you're getting a lot of value out of 1 card. Also, it has trigger to rest a 4 or less character, so it has a very relevant trigger for when your opponent is attacking you. Next, we have Trafalgar Law. It's a 4,000 power for 4 with activate main. You may return this character to its owner's hand. If your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, they place 1 card on the bottom of your deck. So in a format already about card advantage, this card lets you eat away at your opponents. Plus, it's a 2k counter. So if you play it on board, you can get in for an attack, then use its ability to return it to hand to have that 2k power active in your hand. It's a really versatile card that sees probably a lot more value in limited than it might even see in constructed, even though this is a constructed playable blue card. Then we have Slave Arrow, a 1-drop event counter from blue. You may return one of your characters who costs 2 or more to the owner's hand. Give it to one of your leaders or characters 4,000 power for this battle. With trigger, draw 2, place 2 cards from your hand on the bottom of your deck. It's literally blue Rad Beam, except for you need to pay the cost of bouncing a unit. But for Rad Beam in limited, we will definitely pay that cost. And it's uncommon, so you're definitely gonna see these. This is a really interesting one. I don't think like you're gonna see this everywhere, but I want to make sure you know it exists. This is Mega Dawn Ninetales Rush, a 3-cost event with main. If you have equal to or less Dawn cards than your opponent, set a Foxy as active. Now here's the thing. This will most likely only see play in the Eustass Kid deck because they can trash this when they're not using it, or if for some reason your opponent wants to play the Foxy leader. In which case, definitely look out for this card. It's a common. They will have copies. There is a Foxy character that is already a great large body in the set. So for the Eustass Kid players, they're already going to play that body. Playing this card has a very, very low cost when they can just trash it to leader. And they're going to be able to make multiple swings out of another character, not just their leader. So just remember this card exists. Don't lose to randomly getting blown out by this card. Yeah. We have this 5-cost Rob Lucci with 6k power. With on play, you may place 3 cards from your trash on the bottom of your deck in any order. Your opponent trashes a card from your hand. Then you may place up to 1 card from your opponent's trash at the bottom of their deck. So the graveyard manipulation part at the end, not really a huge deal in this limited environment, but a 6k body for 5 is already passable. It has 1k counter, and it immediately makes your opponent trash a card from their hand. And in a format where resources are everything, that is a huge swing ability. We have Iron Body, a 2-cost event with counter. Give up to one of your leaders or characters 4k for the battle, which is already on rate as we talked about earlier. But if your trash has 10 or more cards, you give another 2k. So you potentially max out at a 6k counter for 1 card in 2 Dawn. Plus it has the trigger of give up to a leader or character 1k power for the entire turn. So this card is pretty easy to include in any deck at common. Now this Jinbei is scary. It's a 6k for 5, so it's not vanilla traded, but as a trigger, return a cost 4 or lower character to the opponent's hand, and then you still get to add this card to your hand. So if it gets triggered off life, you get to bounce an opponent's card or have one of yours bounce if it's your opponent's. Then they get a 1k counter to hand still, or a 6k body to play on the board. We have Lucy, this time played by Sabo, a 7k for 6, which has some of the best stapled on removal in the entire set for limited. When attacking once per turn, you may put the top or bottom card of your life into your hand. Rest up to one of your opponent's cost 4 or less characters. Then if your life total is 1 or less, place the top card of your deck onto your life. So this card is interaction and card advantage. It lets you rest an opponent's character and then replaces the life. But the card went into your hand, so you actually end up drawing a card. Plus, it's up to one of your opponent's characters, so you can actually just do this to put a card from your life into your hand, and then put a new card there, essentially drawing a card, even if you have nothing to interact with. This card is an absolute bomb at rare. Do not forget it exists, and if you pull it, oh my god, congratulations, you have a mega bomb, dude. And then there is Flame Split. This event is absolutely cracked in even constructed, but for limited, you gotta be ready for it. So it's a 1-drop event with main and counter. Give up to one of your leaders or characters plus 1,000 power for the turn. Then if your opponent has 2 life or less, so this is something you can kind of control by choosing how aggressive you get in the game, rest up to one of your opponent's 4-cost or lower characters. So you can use this to power up your leader or character to get in for an attack on your opponent's leader or character. And you can use the resting to remove an attacker as the counter mode, or remove a blocker as the main mode, or set a threat into rest so you can attack into it and get off the board before your opponent gets to attack with it themselves. Plus with trigger, rest up to one of your opponent's 4-cost or lower characters. You absolutely cannot go wrong with playing this card at rare. And that's it for the guide. If you have any other questions, please let us know in the comment section down below. And again, if you want a full review of OP07 when it comes to limited, or you want other content up to 2 weeks early for the channel and to support some great content, consider becoming a member and of course subscribing for more great content.